Hey, this is Sam Black going over my first match this set with Lantern Control. I am on the draw here, and I have a hand that only has one land, but it has Lantern and two Codex Shredders to start off with. It's a very good start. That means I'm going to be able to start controlling the tops of both players' libraries as soon as possible. I also have Ancient Stirrings. I can find another land if needed, although I should be able to do that just with the Shredder and the Lantern, but it'll be able to find whatever piece I need fairly quickly. So this is more or less exactly what you're looking for in a hand. Obviously, it'd be a little bit better if the second Lantern were another land or an ensnaring bridge or something, but it's basically any hand that has a land, a Lantern, and a Shredder, a Bell, or a Pixis is a pretty easy keep. So I'm going to keep this. Opponent also keeps 7. And most Colonnade matchups are relatively good. Not great, but I think I'm a favorite. And my opponent shows Spell Snare. The only thing in my deck that it can hit is Crane, which unfortunately I've drawn. We're going to see if we can find a window to resolve that through the Spell Snare. If not, no big deal. I already have plenty of copies of everything I need. The Crane's kind of a luxury at this point. And Mox Opal is a good draw. It's a mana source. It's not better than a land here. In fact, it's a little bit worse than a land for the most part, because it means that future Mox Opals won't accelerate me. Although I can theoretically go Shredder, Opal, Stirrings, Land, Shredder, in which case it would be better if I want to take that exact line than a land would be. And I see the top card of my deck is an Ensnaring Bridge. So I'm going to play a Shredder. I'm fine with my opponent drawing planes. We're going to see if this Shredder resolves. And my opponent is going to Logic Knot. So I lose my Shredder. That's okay. But it does turn off my Mox Opal this turn, so I can't do anything else. So against blue decks, there are definitely spots where when they have 2 mana, you want to not do anything, because they usually do have cards like Negate, Logic Knot, Mana Leak, and most of their counterspells cost 2 mana, the exception being Spell Pierce. And playing against 2 mana counterspells or against Spell Pierce, when you have a hand full of 1 mana spells, there's a significant incentive to wait and cast multiple spells in a turn, so that your opponent can only counter 1 spell and then you get to resolve the others. Or if it's Spell Pierce and you have a lot of mana, it just stops functioning as a counterspell. However, that strategy only works when you actually have lands to develop so that you can cast multiple spells in a turn. Here, I only have 1 land, and I have multiple good artifacts. I can lose my Codex Shredder and still have another Codex Shredder. It's not that big of a deal. I can Ancient Stirrings and find yet another one. So I'm happy to just spend my turn. If my opponent has a counterspell, great. If my opponent has a Remand, even better. I get that out of their hand so that I can resolve a spell next turn, and I still have my Shredder. And if my opponent doesn't have something, then I get to start executing my Lantern Lock. So with a hand like this, that is where the primary constraint is mana, I have all my good stuff, I just need the ability to deploy it. In that kind of spot, I think that it's best to just power through the counter spells, let them counter your spells. But it's worth keeping in mind that there are other spots against this kind of deck where it's better to just pass and build up so that you can cast several spells in a turn. So anyway, my opponent's top card is Snapcaster Mage. Never something I want to see, because it means that I can't deny access to a certain spell. If I mill it, it's still just in their graveyard where they can use Snapcaster. But I'm not going to sacrifice my Lantern to get rid of it. I could. I have a backup Lantern, but at this stage in the game, while my opponent might still be constrained on mana, I don't think it's worth doing, especially since I don't know that I can resolve the other lantern. And also it sets me further back on being able to use this Mox Opal, which is going to be important to having mana to do stuff. So let my opponent draw a Snapcaster, and I draw the Ensnaring Bridge, and I'm going to cast a second Lantern here. This is a way to turn on my Mox Opal, or threaten to turn on my Mox Opal without risking a card that matters. This is a backup Lantern, it's redundant. It's not something my opponent should want to counter, but they do kind of want to counter whatever I play here to turn off my Mox Opal. So by baiting with this, I'm putting them in the hard choice of either letting me get my extra mana so I can cast another spell, or countering this card that doesn't really matter. And then with that having resolved, I'm going to try the Codex Shredder, see if my opponent lets that resolve. Okay, coast seems to be clear. I have a Codex Shredder in play. That's a really good sign. I think that I can conclude from that, given that my opponent countered the previous Codex Shredder but allowed this one to resolve, they've demonstrated that they don't want to let me get this lock going. That's something that they definitely respect, but they didn't counter this when it's basically the same spot that it was last turn. So I can fairly safely conclude they don't have another counterspell they can play here, which is definitely good to know when I'm figuring out which cards I can let them have and which cards I can't. So no problem letting them have more lands, so I'm not going to get rid of that Godless Shrine. And also, I'm not really interested in drawing another Lantern, so I'm planning on milling myself with the Shredder. And here my opponent just runs out the Snapcaster Mage, which is an interesting line. It really depends on my opponent's deck in general, whether this is the correct strategy. They're giving up access to this being a potential counterspell later on. In exchange, they get some pressure now. And it's kind of reasonable for them to feel like they need to end the game, because I do have this Lantern Shredder combo, lock, whatever you want to call it, established. So anyway, from my end, I'm happy to have the Snapcaster out of the way. Now that's not something I need to worry about. I'll take a couple of hits, but this Crane is going to block the Snapcaster really well. My opponent can probably answer that, then the bridge will stop the Snapcaster, and my opponent has shown me 3 colors that aren't red, so I'm not really worried about taking a few hits from Snapcaster and getting into Lightning Bolt range. I don't think it's likely that they have Godless Shrine, Swamp Island, Colonnade, and Lightning Bolt in their deck. So from my perspective here, this is good for me, but I can't know that it's wrong from my opponent's perspective. But if it's right, it's kind of a sign of weakness about their deck as a whole. And so either way, whether it's a good play or a bad play for my opponent to make, it's a play that I'm going to be happy about, because either it indicates that they are just making a mistake, or that their deck is poorly positioned for the matchup. So either way, good news for me. So Snapcaster comes down. Obviously nothing to do with that logic knot that they can't cast anyway. And I see Brain in a Jar on top, which I'm going to ignore, if for no other reason than the fact that I have a needle and I can name it if I'm worried about Brain in a Jar for some reason. But it also doesn't seem that scary. It makes it cheaper for them to cast spells, but I've already taken the path of letting them draw lands and controlling their drawing of actual spells, so that's not a big deal. It also does let them scry, but in a really clunky and expensive way, where they get a few scries, and I can easily interrupt that with the effects of a Shredder. So it doesn't seem like Brain in a Jar is a very scary card for me here. So moving on, I mill myself, hit the Lantern. Oh, right, I'm trying to click OK, so if it's a game I need to move forward. So I mill the Lantern, draw a land, happy to draw a land. And I commented that I have the Crane to stop Snapcaster, but my opponent does still have that Spell Pierce. So that's not actually a thing that's going to happen. So I'm not going to prioritize casting the Crane, since it'll just get countered by Spell Pierce when I do. But remembering that my opponent almost certainly doesn't have a counter spell, except for the Spell Snare. Remembering that my opponent almost definitely doesn't have a counter except for the Spell Snare, I feel comfortable just taking this turn to resolve the Ensnaring Bridge. I could Ancient Stirrings for the Ghoul Caller spell, which is a card that I'd like to have, but it's already on top of my deck. I can just draw it next turn, and I don't need to worry about being able to activate it this turn because I already have 1 mill piece and I'm happy with the top card of my opponent's deck. So I can take the more mana efficient line, play the Ensnaring Bridge, draw the Ghoul Caller spell that I want to draw anyway, and then cast it, Ancient Stirrings, to find something else that I want. In general, unless you need something literally right now, if the top card of your deck is good, wait, draw it, cast Ancient Stirrings when the top card of your deck is bad to get rid of that and choose a different card under it that's good. So, play Ensnaring Bridge, pass, let my opponent draw this Brain in a Jar that I've already explained why I don't care about, and my opponent shows me an interesting card, Beck Call. So, most often this is seen in like elf combo decks as a backup Glimpse of Nature, but that does not seem to be my opponent's plan. My opponent is just using this as their win condition in a control deck. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure how it works with Brain in a Jar. I would guess that my opponent's plan is to use Brain in a Jar for 2 to cast Beck and then declare Beck and call. Maybe that works, maybe it doesn't. I don't actually know. So I could look that up at some point. I haven't, and I didn't in the course of this game. I just figured, well, alright, you've demonstrated a plan, we'll give you credit for that plan, and I'll just needle the Brain in a Jar so that you can't use Brain in a Jar to fuse Beck Call, if that is something that one can do. So they play the Brain, and I mill the Beck Call because I want to be able to give them lands without really worrying about it, and while this card isn't that scary, it is 8 mana draw 4, and that's a draw 4 is something that I'm just afraid of in general, because that's 3 draws that I don't get any say over. So best to just get rid of that, not worry about whatever that's trying to do. Opponent shows Mana Tithe. I can easily play around Mana Tithe. My top card is a Needle, so I'm going to play the Bell, play Needle. My opponent's going to activate Brain in a Jar in response. I'll just go ahead and needle the Brain in a Jar, and I'm fine drawing the other needle. I can name Colonnade, I guess, though it's not really important when I have Ensnaring Bridge. So now my opponent's showing Flooded Strand on top, so I figure might as well just needle that. They're trying to get to a lot of mana, and it gives them an extra shuffle. And I don't really care about the Colonnade because of the Ensnaring Bridge, as I mentioned. So I name Flooded Strand, and I realized that at this point in the game, my opponent has so much mana, this Crane is never getting better. I should just cast it, let them counter it, and then Snapcaster can't attack me anymore. So that's obviously going to get Spell Snared. Pass. My opponent draws Flooded Strand, and still has a Flooded Strand on top, so getting good value out of that needle. They can't attack. I draw another Ancient Stirrings, and now I'm just going to stir. Find a Glimmer Void because I'm still pretty light on mana, and my opponent has had enough. guessing that they have not very many answers to Ensnaring Bridge and can't power through Ghoul Caller's Bell and Codex Shredder, with presumably more of that coming from the other Ancient Stirrings, although I don't think they know about that. But very reasonable time to concede. I don't think they really had any chance here. So that is the end of that game. And then in the second game, let's get this straightened out. So obviously my opponent's still going to be on the play here. And my sideboarding was to remove all of the cranes, since my opponent showed Spell Snare and successfully resolved a Spell Snare countering a spell. Figured there's a reasonable chance they would leave it in, and if I just cut my cranes, then my opponent has dead cards. There's nothing else they can counter. And so Crane is also just a kind of clunky card that's difficult to resolve through counter spells in general. Might miss. If it misses, it's completely blank. And I'm also just not in that much of a hurry to assemble my pieces. I'd rather just have more different things going on rather than that thing to give me more of the same thing, if that makes sense. So brought in another Surgical and probably Grafdigger's Cage to fight Snapcaster. Just cards that weren't 2-mana spells that my opponent could counter. It didn't change a lot. So here there's the question between, well, I can lead with Stirrings, Inquisition, or Lantern. Never lead Stirrings in a spot like this. It's better to stir later, but as a general rule, because you get more draw steps to figure out what you're missing, and then you can try to find that. And I'd rather just do something that's going to be impactful immediately. The Lantern will let me start gaining information, and the Inquisition will threaten my opponent's ability to do things. My opponent did mulligan once here, by the way. So rule out the Ancient Stirrings. Then the question is between Lantern and Inquisition. There's a drawback to Lantern in that it allows my opponent to determine whether they want to sacrifice their fetch land or not. It basically gives them a free scry. So I believe I go with the Inquisition, especially because my opponent is Esper, so they could have a Stony Silence, although with Abrupt Decay that's not as much of a concern as it might normally be. However, I don't actually have the mana to cast Abrupt Decay without the real desperation move of Blooming Marsh, tap for green, Ghost Quarter, get a swamp, tap for black, but then turn my 2 lands into 1 land to cast Abrupt Decay. Not really desirable. Easiest if I can just Inquisition a Stony Silence if my opponent has it. So I'm going to lead with the Inquisition. And I see 2 Esper Charms and a Shadow of Doubt and a Cryptic Command, which I can't take. And my opponent has Godless Shrine, Polluted Delta. So Godless Shrine is going to not particularly contribute to casting the Cryptic Command. And note that I've drawn Surgical Extraction. Shadow of Doubt, also not really a card that does anything against me. I suppose I can Ghost Quarter myself. I do have Inventor's Fair, but for the most part, this is not a scary card because I'm not playing fetch lands. This is a card that my opponent almost certainly is playing because they just didn't have enough cards that weren't awful, and they just want to cycle. So anyway, Esper Charm is the best card, and it sets up Surgical Extraction on Esper Charm to get rid of the other Esper Charm. Well, I guess Shadow of Doubt does also counter Surgical Extraction, but knowing that it's there, I can play around that pretty easily. So anyway, I'm just going to take an Esper Charm. And my opponent plays the Godless Shrine and passes. Note they paid life for that Godless Shrine. It's possible that they drew a 2-mana spell. Most likely that means that they're just planning to cast the Shadow of Doubt at the end of my turn. And so I drew Codex Shredder, so I have Lantern Codex Shredder, and I know that my opponent doesn't have a counterspell they can cast, so pretty straightforward line here. Cast that, see what's going on, see that my opponent did not side out Spell Snare, which is great news for me. This card, as I've mentioned in my sideboarding, literally blank, so I'm definitely not going to Codex Shred it. Just play Shredder, pass, my opponent's shuffling, unfortunate, there goes the Spell Snare. Gitzland shows another Esper Charm, and now they're going to cycle Shadow of Doubt. Now this is awesome for me. The Shadow of Doubt's gone, so they can't use it to prevent some part of surgical extraction, and they've now put a second Esper Charm in their hand, so I can surgical and get Esper Charm, Esper Charm, Esper Charm. So let the Shadow of Doubt resolve, and now I don't really want to cast the surgical on my turn because the Shadow of Doubt is in effect. I could just cast it because I would still get to get the Esper Charm in my opponent's graveyard and the 2 in their hand, but I wouldn't be able to shuffle their deck, and at least I think it's possible that it would shuffle anyway, but I'm not sure. And I am pretty sure that my opponent doesn't have a counterspell. So my plan here is to just wait until my opponent's upkeep. I don't want to let them draw the surgical. Wait until my opponent's upkeep to surgical the Esper Charms, get a free shuffle out of that, and then I still have the Codex Shredder to control their deck further from there. So it's my opponent's upkeep, surgical the Esper Charm, and I get to see their library here. Notably, well, they only had 2 Esper Charms, but so their threats are Beck Call and Colonnade and Snapcaster Mage and nothing else. They have 1 Engineered Explosives and 4 Cryptic Commands, and I believe those are the only ways that they can get an Ensnaring Bridge off the table. And so in general, this is not a matchup they're well positioned for. Other cards that matter a little bit are 2 Negate, 3 Logic Knot. The Mana Tithe at this point isn't going to do anything. 4 Surgicals is a lot. That's something to watch out for. Sorry about that. Yeah, 2 Spell Snares. Those don't do anything. Overall, looks like a pretty safe situation. So I'm just going to get rid of these Esper Charms, leave my opponent with only a Cryptic. They've also, the one draw that I didn't know about was a Plains, which is a really awkward draw because it means that they have 3 lands, but they can only use 2 of the 3 toward casting Cryptic Command. So this Cryptic Command is not a very big threat. So they draw Beck Call, which I could mill that since it's kind of a large portion of their ability to win a game, but they're so far from doing anything with it that I think it's safe to let them have it. Also, I have Inquisition on my top. On the top of my deck, I can just Inquisition and take it if it's a concern. So I don't want to let my opponent draw Negate. So we're going to mill the Negate and show Surgical, another card I don't want my opponent to have. And I have a Stirrings on top, always a good card for me. So I'm going to mill the Surgical and see a Snapcaster, which I also don't want my opponent to have. So here I'm going to cast Ancient Stirrings. Sad to get rid of this other Ancient Stirrings, but I do want to try to find another mill piece to stop my opponent from drawing Snapcaster. And I don't hit one. So I'm just going to take the Mox Opal, get rid of this stuff, play the Opal. Now, a bit of a saving grace for me. My opponent can Snapcaster Surgical here, but none of the cards in my graveyard are that important. It's fine to lose any of those from my deck. Surgical is just not that important of a card for me, and I got a good effect out of it. It was a good card, but that's not, like, I would rather have them in my deck than not. It would let me potentially mill a Cryptic Command from my opponent and Surgical their Cryptics to get the last Cryptic out of their hand. But if I lose them, it's not the end of the world. Inquisition, that's fine. I don't really want to draw more of those anyway. Ancient Stirrings, again, it's nice, but when I have Lantern Shredder, I can just naturally control the top of my deck and draw the cards that I want to draw rather than needing to search for them with that. So, not in a position to get super punished by this Snapcaster. Top of my opponent's deck is Brain in a Jar, which might be scary with the Beck and Call. We're assuming that it probably is. Looking at their deck, that's clearly what their deck is designed to do. So I hope that it works. I don't want to draw another Mox Opal. I already have one. It's a blank draw, so I'm just going to mill myself, because I don't really care if my opponent draws the Brain in a Jar, because I can Inquisition the Beck Call. So I'm going to draw a Glimmer Void, and I'm going to cast the Inquisition. My opponent is going to... They can either use the Snapcaster now and Surgical something, but again, don't really care about any of the things that are in my graveyard that much, or they can let the Inquisition resolve, and then I have my choice of Snapcaster and Surgical. Snapcaster and Back Call. And my opponent thinks about going for the Snapcaster, but then decides to just let it resolve. So I'm going to take the Snapcaster, clearly. My opponent is thinking, well, I'll just let me take the Snapcaster, and then they still have the Beck Call, and they have Brain in a Jar on top of their deck, so they'll be able to set up their Brain in a Jar Beck Call. But, of course, as they can see, there's an Abrupt Decay on top of my library. There also happens to be one in my hand. I mentioned that I didn't care about the Brain in a Jar because I could just get rid of Beck, but in this case, I don't care about the Brain in a Jar because it just lets me use my Abrupt Decay. I can kill the Brain in a Jar that way, and then my opponent has to get to 8 mana for Beck Call to actually matter, which might come up at some point in this game, but that's a long way away. So they draw Brain in a Jar, they cast Brain in a Jar, and in the name of mana efficiency, I'm going to kill it on my turn rather than waiting to draw the other Abrupt Decay to conceal the fact that I have an Abrupt Decay in my hand. I'm really not worried about that secret. My opponent is just not in a position to really play around what I have anyway, and it just doesn't matter very much. So, get rid of that. Draw another Abrupt Decay. Not the best card, but I think it's just good enough to not force me to use a Shred. I'd rather save those when I can. And I do want to stop my opponent from getting 2 blue mana. I want to, in general, control my opponent's blue mana to try to stop them from casting Cryptic Command. But with only 1 mill, I don't think using it going into their draw step is a good idea. I would hate to be in a position where I felt obligated to sacrifice my Lantern to control the top of their library from there. So I'll let them draw this, and then we can look into trying to fight over the 3rd blue at some point. There's the 3rd blue, and now I could fight over that, or I can try to control the top of my own deck. And all this 3rd blue is doing is letting them cast the 1 Cryptic Command. And it's kind of a lot of work to fight over every blue mana my opponent could possibly draw. So I'm just going to ignore it, mill myself. Now I've found Surgical Extraction, which is definitely a great thing to have access to. My opponent has Snapcaster Mage in their graveyard, so now if they ever would draw a Snapcaster, I can just get rid of all of those. And that's just its floor. We have options on doing other things from there. So draw that, pass, and oh, sorry, I didn't pass. I do actually decide to fight over the 3rd island, which in hindsight, I think is probably wrong, although given that the top card of my deck, it's weird. I think it's wrong, but on the other hand, I've seen my opponent's deck. I know they have very few cards that matter. The problem is, like, what if the top card is Telling Time? That's really not a card that I want to let my opponent have, because it gives them something where I don't know what they ended up with, and worst case scenario for them, it almost certainly at least lets them find another blue mana. So I think I probably should have just let them have the one cryptic, and I don't think that they can beat me with a single cryptic, but it looks like I decided to just, given that there's another Codex Shredder on top of my deck, see if I could lock them out here. So, mill, get lucky, let them draw a Spell Snare. That's fine, they draw a Spell Snare. Now I'm going to untap, I get to play another Shredder. Academy Ruins on top is nice. Don't really want them to draw Logic Knot, that's a hard counter. Don't really want them to draw a Ghost Quarter when I have Academy Ruins on top, and now we've come to the point where I could fight over this Colonnade by using the Surgical. That would shuffle their library, but I've had enough. I'm not going to fight over the Colonnade or over the Cryptic anymore. I'll just let them have it. So they play that, and now Cryptic's going to be online. But now I don't have to worry about them getting the 3 blue mana. And I draw Academy Ruins, play Academy Ruins, pass the turn, let them draw another land. Ghost Quarter on top. Don't really want them to Ghost Quarter still. They're going to sacrifice their land in response. Apparently they care about keeping Ghost Quarter in their deck. Show a Surgical. Surgical gets milled. And my opponent got Breeding Pool. And I still don't want them to draw Surgical, so I mill that. Now they have a Logic Knot on top. I draw another Ensnaring Bridge. And I'm going to play the Ensnaring Bridge and mill the Logic Knot. Let them draw a Swamp. And now I'm realizing that I've let them get perilously close to just hard casting Back Call, which might not matter, but is a risk that I would prefer not to take. So, anyway, I'm going to mill myself because I obviously don't want Darkslick Shores. Untap. Don't want Mox Opal. And I'm just going to draw the Lantern. It's not great, but it's not blank. Lets me shuffle away something bad at some point in the future. And I'm going to Ghost Quarter the Colonnade here because I want to shuffle my opponent's deck to stop them from getting to 8 mana. And I'd kind of rather they not have a Colonnade anyway, in case they deal with my Ensnaring Bridges. I don't know. They can't really deal with both of them, but I don't know. And now we've gotten to a really good point where the top card of my opponent's deck is Back Call. I have Codex Shredder. I can mill the Back Call, and I have Surgical. I can exile the Back Call, which would also get the one in their hand, which would also get basically the way that their deck wins, maybe. The problem is that my opponent has Cryptic Command up, so they can counter my Surgical. So I mill the Back Call, my opponent lets that resolve, and now there's another Cryptic Command coming, and unfortunately I can't mill them again to get that, but my opponent does only have 7 mana now, so they're not about to cast the Back Call, and they're going to draw this Cryptic, and I suppose when they cast one Cryptic, I can at least Surgical that to get the other Cryptic out of their hand, potentially. So that's something. And then I'm going to pass here, and my opponent is going to consider casting Cryptic, and then actually cast Cryptic, bouncing one of my ensnaring bridges and drawing another Cryptic command. However, now they've tapped out, so I can use my Surgical to get rid of the back calls. And one of my 2 ensnaring bridges is in my hand, but the other one's still in play. So I'm not entirely sure what the goal was here, but the effect was that they lost all of their back calls. And then they conceded, because at that point they basically don't have the ability to win anymore. So that was the match. In general, weird Esper control decks are very bad against Lantern. Usually it's something like very similar to this, where they have some counter spells, but you can get set up under them, and they don't have enough removal. They can't threaten to burn you out the way that the Jeskai decks can, and their endgame is usually some kind of nonsense that involves attacking in some fashion, and they don't have enough ways to fight over Ensnaring Bridge to make that actually work. So, unusual matchup in terms of the exact construction of my opponent's deck, but fairly standard for a narrow archetype, but still a swath of decks that one does sometimes play against in Modern.